Thank you, Amitendu. And I think you've given us plenty of food for thought. Aside from the calculus of getting to the 5 trillion economy, it's also the pervasive distortions in the input markets that prevail in India, be it land or labor. Now there is an attempt to consolidate that, but you still have some way to go indeed on that. I'm going to start off by posing a few questions to the panelists. And let me just start off on the last point first on external commercial borrowings. It's been indicated as a way of testing the waters, to what extent are markets receptive. But at a time when export earnings are really low and they've been stagnant, and wishing for a revival in real estate market, I couldn't help but think of the experience in both Latin America and East Asia. These are economies that had borrowed extensively domestically and then went on a splurge in international markets. And the large multinational banks at a time when lending was low in the US were only too happy to lend at a high risk premium. The outcome we know was a crisis of the sorts that had not been witnessed. If I may turn to the panel, how do you envisage that? What is the insurance? You can't have an insurance, but what sort of a bulwark can we possibly have against a twin crisis developing? And particularly since bank lending is more or less stagnant at the moment as well.
I'll try and give you as pragmatic an answer as possible. India is blessed with the most conservative chartered accountants and bureaucrats. Time and again, it's proved that our financial prudence and management of the country has been quite stellar compared to anywhere in the world. Latin America was not blessed with such wisdom. Two, I think, as Amitendu mentioned, it's a great departure we're making. I think it's the magnitude of your borrowing and how you manage it. Because this would completely open a new vista for you to sort of kickstart and make the structural changes in India. Because if you look at the whole world today, where are the investment pockets available which are of this kind of nature and quality? If you look at it comparative in the development world, destination India is a hugely marketable destination. And with the kind of government you have today, I think the timing is phenomenal. I don't think we should miss this opportunity, but at the same time, I think there will be great amount of prudence not to overdo it, but not doing it is really missing one of the finest chances you have to sort of remake your economy.
And I completely agree with what Amitendu said about the risk of crowding out private investment, and this gives the space, indeed, for domestic revival, of course. Mr. Rai, if I may turn to you, you're uniquely placed with experience both on forming the budget and then subsequently assessing how the taxpayers' dollar or rupee was spent. And this is something we learned in Economics 101, that money should be spent where it can be utilized most efficiently or does maximum good to the public. And particularly in what's referred to as social sectors like health, education, or development of infrastructure. And I see a sharp contrast in China where there's a huge amount of policy experimentation. It's not that you decide upon a program and the only accountability is, did he go through 3 tenders? Did he get the best bidder? And was the money well spent? But more in a dynamic sense, looking at the efficacy of each rupee or each yuan that was spent on public expenditures. What do you see? I mean, what can happen in this front? I mean, I was really hoping that given the promises of the government, there would be some mention on greater scrutiny of the huge amount of resources that are put into development expenditures. I know at state levels there are some pilot programs going on, but do you see something happening at a systemic level here, or is there a possibility?
See, there are 3 ways in which it can be done. One, of course, is the traditional performance auditing, which is done by the Auditor-General in all jurisdictions. And the Auditor-General of India does that also, which is examining the efficacy of every rupee that has been spent. I mean, performance auditing as against, say, conventional auditing or financial auditing looks into the efficiency of that spending, in the sense that suppose it was looking at a program which is otherwise called a midday feeding program. Conventional audit will look at the fact that, okay, money, 100 rupees was allotted, 100 rupees was utilized, it was utilized, any utilization certificate has been provided, ledgers, etc. have been properly maintained, and that's fine, as long as the utilization certificate has been provided. But performance auditing would go a step further and try and figure out whether the midday meal scheme has improved the nutritional standards of the kids coming to the school, whether the school dropout rate has improved, and things of that kind, which conform to the original objectives of the midday meal program. So that is one part of it. UPA 1, or was it UPA 2, I think had started what was known as an independent evaluation office as an independent unit of the Planning Commission. They were required to do an independent evaluation of all plan schemes of the government, especially in the social sector. That didn't take off after the government's changed, and that has not been given much of a fillip. But what the government now is looking to do is doing social audit, which means for schemes, social sector schemes like, say, rural health, rural employment, midday meal scheme as I talked about, or Awas Yojana, housing schemes, etc. in the rural areas, the units themselves, if it's being spent, money is being spent by a department, the local self-government, which means the panchayat bodies will do the audit of that, and that's what's known as rural social audit. Also, it's been thrown open to citizens' bodies under the RTI, and that's where a citizen can approach the department concerned or the panchayat concerned and say, how much have you spent, how have you spent it, please put out the details. And the concerned departmental official is obliged to explain that. Now, I would sincerely believe that if this activity is taken up seriously by citizens groups, this would achieve much faster than what any formal audit institution will be able to achieve in terms of maintaining a vigilant over or an accountability over public spending, which would obviously improve the efficiency of that spending.
Thank you. And the critical input out here for citizens to make an informed decision is to have the information at hand. An example, if you're talking about open defecation, for instance, research has shown the highest incidence, including of amoebiasis, is in areas with a high density, population density, if that stands to reason, but also the widest social distance in areas where untouchability is practiced the most, right? The question out here is, if there's a continuous study and citizens empowerment, local government empowerment is critical for that, do they have the wherewithal to give feedback to the district level, the block, the district level, and beyond, in order to change course if need be or modify course? So in other words, you're not just set in concrete, this is expenditure, this has got to be done, the target's met, and the district magistrate's job is over.
See, social audit, the way it was originally programmed, unfortunately, the department spending money was supposed to report the spending. And that report of spending, which was to be submitted quarterly, ran into 27 pages. A nightmare to fill up that table. Even a person like an auditor like me wouldn't have been able to do it. We reduced it to a single page format. And that single page format can be looked at and filled up and submitted to the district magistrate or whichever is the institution which is fulfilling that by any citizen. Now, the only question is how seriously you take this. When you get a feedback from a citizen, how seriously do you look at it, and how much are you willing to bring about correctives on the suggestions that have been given to you? That depends from government to government, department to department.
Thank you. And we do see evidence about how in certain districts or regions you find very significant differences. I'm going to play the role of a devil's advocate for a moment. You mentioned there's a fundamental shift starting off in 2014, and there's a clear direction in which the government is going. I was just having a conversation with Amitendu before coming out here, and one of the issues that came up during the course of the conversation was from a developmental state, a state that's driven on nurturing private enterprise, giving more agency to the people. Doesn't the budget suggest we're moving more towards, reverting back more towards a welfare state?
I don't think there's a conflict there. You need to really understand and experience India to get a context to why this budget is fashioned in the manner in which it is. I liked the summary of an economist who said, this is a popular budget without being populist. It's a beautiful summary, because I think you can't move away from the fact that still in India, maybe 60% or 65% of population lives about a daily wage level of between 5 to 8 US dollars. And whatever you're talking about, making a difference to the people of India must have programs that deliver. 2014 to now, what this election has proven is the government has finally found a method to put something back in a person's hands which is measurable, feelable, and deliverable, whether it is the public distribution system, whether it is electricity, whether it is the 550 districts where the district magistrates have been mandated and are also being monitored by the PMO's office. All of this, and the women who came in a big and large way, whether it is about giving them support during their pregnancy or about health, I think there is clearly a deliverance to the people. And please understand, the power of India is not just in the budget, it's in the people of India. If you can unleash the power and the ability and capabilities they have in the youth bulge, and if MSME doesn't sound sexy, but if you look at MSME and if we are able to spur that sector, that is the sector that actually employs the largest percentage of people. Because you don't get the numbers reported in economic times. When we as a group recruit, in fact yesterday we had TCS recruiting 30,000 engineers this year, and it comes out as a big employment number. But MSME in a year takes in a few lakh people, it doesn't come out. So I think we should never distance from the people, and I think good thing about the government is it is working schemes which will eventually continue and deliver that value at the bottom of the pyramid, which I don't think they should shift their focus. Having said that, I think the tasks ahead for any government in India to make a change, whether it's on the structural reform or the public sector, I think the asking rate is huge. The system to crank deliverance is quite difficult. And I would just put one last word on it. How well this budget plays out is exactly the difference between a talk and do ratio. They've talked right, we have to see how much they are able to deliver. Thank you.
Thank you. I should clarify, when I was talking about move to a welfare state, it's more of, the more blunt word would have been a popular state. And in particular, if you think of the loan waivers, which every government has in agriculture, and most of the beneficiaries of these tend to be kulaks, are the mid-sized or the large farmers who get the fertilizer subsidies, the power subsidies, and that's been a huge drain. The people at the bottom of the pyramid still remained pretty much marginalized. And again, the previous question was alluding more towards understanding and how efficient are the expenditures on the social sector. And that's an area where we do need to, and hopefully, as Mr. Rai pointed out, there is tangible movement, and we'll see progress.
Yeah.
One of the stark differences between Southeast Asia and India is if you look at health and education metrics. So India has the IITs, the IIMs, but it's an abysmal state when you're looking at primary education. I mean, you just have to look at any of the Pratham and ASA reports, and you realize half the kids come out barely literate after having passed primary school. They're unable to do class 2. And that's where there's, I think, with incremental effort and a more conscious intervention, there's a tremendous amount of scope for raising. And this not something that needs just money.
I
in a
totally agree with
sense.
you. I think the school dropout rate in India is about 45%.
It's very high.
Which is exceptionally high. But with 45% rate, which means 55% pass out, India produces 1.7 million engineers a year, and the best talents outside. So if you look at the total numbers, education hasn't failed, but much, much more needs to be done. I totally agree with you. Yeah.
Thank you. Rohan, if I turn to you, you raised some very important, one area that's really flourishing, or seems to be doing very well, are the startups. But a disproportionate number of them have listed overseas. There are a lot of them in Silicon Valley, in Israel, in Estonia, and a large cohort in Singapore. So when I was looking at the material, you come across headlines such as Singapore poaching enterprises from India. And the point is, and I'm wondering if you would agree with this, is those enterprises may not exist otherwise, because the nirvana for a startup is the exit, right? When they go public eventually. You get a much lower valuation in India for the same enterprise, and the venture capitalists may not be willing to put up money for that reason as well. So how would you respond to that? And the other question is about the taxation, if you could talk about, that's another major reason, particularly on capital gains in the first year, or whether it starts after 3 years.
Thank you. So let me answer both, if I can. In the context of startups, you're right. I mean, the exit is nirvana. But if you see who is buying these, that's the main question. And you will always see that these are the large private equity firms or funds which are making the investments into the Indian startups, right? The reason they make the investments are not because there are startups in India, but because they are companies in which the private equity believe that they can take it to a level for the private equity to exit, right? So therefore, the product, the firms who make those investments believe in 2 or 3 things. One is the people who run the company, the employees that they have, and the product. If all the 3 boxes are ticked, then they'll make the investment whether it is India or whether it is Estonia. So I think the Indian startup, and Indians by and large have always been entrepreneurial, which is why if you see most of the Indian large corporates as well as the mid-market segment, they've always been entrepreneurial, trying to work for their own, whether it's a small shop they run or whether it's a large business they run. So the startup fever in technology, or startup fever, or the enthusiasm that is there, to my mind will continue. And I think we produce some of the finest brains, intellect and brains that are there, which is visible. And having said that, not only in the startup scene, but if you see by the sheer size of population, we are the largest exporter of the best talent anywhere that is there in the world. Right. So that's on the startup scene. I hope I've answered your question in the context of the ecosystem of startups and how they are doing.
That's outstanding, absolutely. And there are a large number of incubators which have been doing very well, as well as accelerators. And the domestic funding is. But the external funding, the question is also, if I may extend it for a moment, is actually if we just walked up the street from here, around the corner, about 100 yards, you'll come across a building I cubed. And it's a wonderful place to walk through. You find a whole bunch of youngsters from across the world, large cohort from India, China, and they're all thrashing out ideas. And what you're obviously hoping for is this will generate the next unicorn. But does it matter where they domicile? Should that be a policy concern?
No, it doesn't.
Why is it a policy concern in the
it
Ministry
is
of
not.
Commerce?
It is not a concern. I don't think it's a concern. And I agree with you, it doesn't matter where it's domiciled. I think from a government perspective, if you have to look at the government and their policy, the question that will often get asked is, what is the government doing to incentivize startups? And therefore, to address one of that concern is what they are doing. So I don't think it is driven by anything else except for the fact that the government should be seen to be providing the necessary infrastructure and the ecosystem for the young entrepreneurs to flourish. And I think that's what they're putting in place. Whether that comes in from a tax regime, whether that comes in from a FDI regime, or whatever support, I think that is what they're trying to put together to make sure that this entire ecosystem flourishes.
Thank you. And that is indeed one of the, I think, the most promising areas. And now that you see the ones that have matured, I mean, even before exiting are expanding into overseas, into highly developed market, Ola, Oyo, and a number of other B2B startups which we don't get to hear of.
In fact,
That
if I may
very
add
often.
one last point before I conclude, this is how Singapore and India should come together and see what we can do and how investment can flow into technology either which way.
That's absolutely, and I think there have been a lot of constructive suggestions about including hackathons, bring the IITs and NUS and NTU. And it has come to fruition in a couple of cases and a lot of them are in the formative stage. If you go again up to iCubed, you'll see that. One quick point, you mentioned something very interesting on e-commerce and the 30% local requirement. Now there's actually work along the line titled When IKEA Comes to Town. So one of the conditions was, of course, it's a single brand, is once you place orders, what does it do to the domestic landscape? Of course, MSMEs would be at the forefront in providing furniture, whatever it is. And the domestic content, again, has to be 30%. Do you see, once you're able to cross the threshold, there are tremendous benefits down the line. It generates externalities. The supplier will have a whole bunch of other suppliers feeding into the supply chain. In logistics, in finance, and the entire spectrum of services gets roped in. Is there scope for further pragmatism, for want of a better word, in the 30%?
So are you saying 30% is high? If I understand, is it high? Is
It's
it right?
difficult to assess, actually. It's a
I mean,
number, I guess.
I guess the philosophy is we want foreign investment in retail, but we also want to protect our own players, right? If the foreign investors are coming in, all that I think Indian government is saying that you source 30%, and mind you, that 30% is not necessarily to be bought by the Indian entity. It can be bought by the Indian entity for their global sourcing, right? So I think from a philosophy and a policy perspective, I think the government seems to be pretty much on the right trajectory to say, you want to invest, we are willing for you to come, but also help our own local suppliers come up to your quality standards. And how can they come up to your quality standards is by you buying from them so that they can supply to your global. And I think that's a fair ask. Now, whether that 30% should be reduced to perhaps 15%, 20% is anyone's guess. But I think that's a norm that is there now.
And there's very encouraging news as well. Amazon, till December last year, had about 6,000 MSMEs selling on its platform, and they suddenly had a global market from not being able to go beyond the local taluka or the block or the district. And now it's an open worldwide market, literally, for them.
Let me just add, please, one perspective to this. Let's not forget, India has existed for aeons as a very domestic protected market. That's a history, that's a heritage. Before IKEA comes to India, everybody has a chair, everybody has a table, everyone has furniture in the home. They're not transformative in that sense. So when people come from MNCs, and we were talking about e-commerce ventures, before the majors of the global came, there were a lot of domestic innovation around e-commerce, and the e-commerce companies were hugely valued in India. So that actually ties in with, it's a country which is very vibrant with entrepreneurship. It's vibrant with its own abilities to satisfy the needs of the consumers. You must have a pragmatism when this single retail comes. Again, if, for instance, one of the examples given was Apple can open more stores. Yes, you can't force Apple to take 30% of their complementary. But for furniture company, I think why should it not be 40%? Why only 30 actually? So I think these debates have to be seen in the context of Indian development curve, how these industries are moving and how you can give a push to the MSMEs. So I see it consistent. I don't see any inconsistency in that.
It's only when you move on to higher value-added
That's right.
items
That's right.
it becomes a more muddied story.
That's right.
Of course, yeah.
I don't think it's muddy.
Thank you. Amitendu, if I may turn to you very quickly. Can I pick on a particular issue on divestment? You mentioned prospects for divestment seem a bit, it's a bit tentative, right, the market. What is it that could possibly give a boost, or what is it in the strategy thus far that's...
Look, my sense is that it's not the first time that divestments and public sector equity is being looked at as an opportunity for not just mobilizing revenues, but also turning around the public sector in some respects. But I think the challenges are within. The challenges are within because when it comes to organizations like Air India, for example, Air India has not been in the pink of health for several years. This is not the first time that Air India is being looked at as a divestment prospect, but it hasn't happened. And it has not happened because the terms and conditions which were prepared for the sale of Air India were such that getting bidders itself was extraordinarily difficult. I don't see how such terms and conditions can be prepared if the intention is to actually invest this entity. I think there has to be some sort of a practicality reached at some stage that, the idea is to invest this organization, it cannot sustain. So there has to be something in it for investors. So that's something which I think is important going forward from the Air India example, that wherever disinvestment happens, it needs to look at the factors to which the market will respond. Because otherwise, I don't really think there's not much point in rolling out these targets year after year and ending up unfinished. I mean, to that extent, one very final point is that I was expecting this particular budget to give a signal on the 5G auction, which might still happen, but for all that you know, the government might be holding it back as a last line of credit to ensure that the revenues come in towards the end of the year.
Thank you. I would now like to open up the discussion to the floor. If I may please ask you to identify yourself, and if you could, please do keep your question brief and pointed. Okay, while you take a moment to mull over, Mr. Pandey, please.
So this is for Amitendu. There seems to be some controversy between the numbers that came out in the economic survey on the budget estimates and the numbers that were presented in Parliament for the budget. And the newspapers have been going around saying some 1 lakh crore is missing, and which means that either the fiscal deficit is higher than what has been projected. But how can someone make a mistake like that? Is there an anomaly in this?
I think the confusion is essentially rising from the fact that the economic survey based its numbers on what we typically call the revised estimates of the budget. And the GDP it had as the benchmark of the calculation was the GDP of the financial year. But obviously, when looking forward to the next year and the budget estimate, which has come in the union budget, bringing down fiscal deficit to 3.3 and subsequently, the budget has taken a much higher rate of GDP growth. It's kind of imputable. So I think the confusion is the little sense that I have been able to make out of it is the economic survey GDP number, which is the number projected for the last national account statement, is brought on to the budget estimate. The fiscal deficit will actually be higher than what has been projected in the budget deficit. 3.3% and 3.37% could be very different. But in the sense of the huge budget number that we are talking about.
Thank you. Any other questions? Pressing? Yes, ma'am. If you could identify yourself as well, please. Oh, there's a microphone by your side. Yeah.
My name is Bhuvana Ravishankar. Actually, I have a question for Rohan. Regarding NRIs, there are certain benefits passed on, right? Whatever, can you highlight on them? And one more question I have is that on the data protection, a lot of outflow of data is there from India to various other countries. How it's going to affect us as an economy in the future? Thank you.
So I will answer the first one on the data privacy or data protection. I'll pass it on. But NRIs, as far as I know, and maybe I've missed some details, I don't think there is much tax benefit given to NRIs. In fact, it's actually brought in some ambit of taxation for NRIs, especially in the context of they've added a special provision which says that if you make a gift of cash more than 50,000 or immovable property, if a resident in India does that to a non-resident, then the non-resident will now become taxable in India. So in fact, they've added that layer of taxation for the NRI. Apart from that, I don't think really they've given any tax incentives or breaks. Of course, they've now made some administrative changes where they've come back and said that if an NRI goes back to India, then he or she can apply for an Aadhaar card immediately instead of waiting for 6 months, etc. The PAN and the Aadhaar can be used interchangeably, etc. So those are more administrative. But if I look at pure tax or regulatory changes, I don't see that happening significantly in this budget.
Is 100% investment in selected sectors or is also extended database?
That was through the FPI mechanism, if I understood correctly, and I think that was through the FPI mechanism that NRIs can now invest. That's the only change that has happened.
I'll address your question on data. This particular session of the Parliament is expected to see the introduction of the Personal Data Protection Bill. Now, there have been two other developments that have happened along with the PDPR. One is the Reserve Bank of India's instructions on data localization. The number two is the issuance of a draft e-commerce policy, which has fairly strong content on data. If I take these three developments together, my sense is that the Personal Data Protection Bill, the way it stands, and it was put by the Sri Krishna Committee, is actually the softest among the three, if one looks at it carefully, because the degree of protection of data within national jurisdictions actually depends very significantly upon the classification of personal data. And to that extent, by and large, I'm not saying totally, but by and large, the Personal Data Protection Bill proposed by the Sri Krishna Committee has a categorization of personal data which is relatively more liberal than certain other countries which have passed data localization laws, but certainly less liberal than a number of other countries as well. We need to see the form in which the bill comes in. But there's an issue over here. The issue is that this Personal Data Protection Bill talks about establishment of a data protection authority, which is supposed to be the regulator. But in the meantime, we have had the financial sector regulator, the Reserve Bank of India, coming out and issuing its own instructions. I think the problem that's going to arise here is that when it comes to matters of data, and particularly cross-border flows of data, whose views are going to prevail? Because the Reserve Bank of India might well insist that, the local storage is the financial regulator's domain. And that remains solid in that emphasis, which might create a problem when it comes to interpretation of the content of storage. And the other expectation was again that this was expected to be a budget when Rohan alluded to incentives. I think there was an expectation that data servers and data storage capacities would be declared infrastructure for getting them benefits under Section 80C of the Income Tax Act. That hasn't happened. So to an extent on the data template and governance framework, gaps remain. There are gaps to be addressed.
And you weren't alluding to data localization, as you. That's another can of worms, in a sense. Obviously, India's keen on data localization rules, and that's partly in the e-commerce sector. The digital sector has been, to some extent, inspired by what's happened with China and what's led to a huge amount of organic growth in the major enterprises. On the other hand, it's a major trade policy issue with the United States right now. We'll see how that resolves. Yes, sir, you had a question there.
Good afternoon to the panel. So my name is Varun Gupta. I represent a lending fund in Singapore. So my question is regarding the banking sector in India. We have seen a few encouraging steps in the banking sector, which is about the recap plan as well as addressing the transparency issues, about the NBC sector also. So, but my question is about the twin balance sheet problem what the banks have in India historically. So they've been struggling to come out of that because of the corporate balance sheet, which is still still bleeding. And so my sense is that this budget has been largely silent on the confidence building measures for the corporate balance sheet. So what is your view regarding that? Thank you.
No, but the budget has been silent on confidence building measures within the banking sector.
Yeah, so I think I can rephrase it. So basically, we see a lot of measures being taken for the balance sheet improvement of the banks. But as we have seen historically, the banks have been plagued by the twin balance sheet problem because the corporate India is still facing issues on the leveraging side, and well as there are no fresh investments coming out. So what are your views on the confidence building measures being provided in this budget for the corporate India?
By investments, you alluding to banks mobilizing funds or lending out?
Lending out.
Lending out.
Lending out, yeah. Thank you.
Would you like to?
See, it's very difficult for a budget document to introduce any kind of confidence building on the corporate balance sheet size. But to the extent that is known today, it's a kind of fact that NPAs have plateaued to the extent that we don't see much large surprises coming out in the form of stressed assets anymore. To that extent, all the audits that have been done of the balance sheet of corporates as well as banks, it's felt that the worst is over. And that's why the government has come out with this recapitalization plan, because knowing that the size of black hole is now more or less determinate. Earlier, we used to say no. 5 years back, you didn't know. Every other day, something was blowing up. I mean, the last that we had was ILFS. Yes, DHFL is also there. But to that extent, it has been determined. And that's why the government has come out with this recapitalization plan, which in itself will offer a certain amount of confidence building. Number one, in the banks. Number two, to the extent that the corporates can leverage themselves in borrowing. So I think that issue seems to have been addressed, but of course, if there are some more, balance sheets which show stress, they will be in the smaller groups.
I mean, the usual traditional method also is the asset reconstruction companies. But that again, you need a very clear evaluation, which is in the works certainly. Yes. Any other questions? Okay, if there aren't any, I'll just turn to a very quick round. We have about 4 or 5 minutes left to the panel. And if you start with or anybody can pick it up. Looking back at the budget, what was the single item which is most reassuring, and what was the issue that you wished for, if you had a wish list, that should have been there and you didn't find it?
Let me start by saying I would have liked the surcharge and the cess to go away, because that would mean it's a flat 25% tax rate, which would then make it very competitive.
I think I've been pretty positive that it's a progressive and directional budget. A lot more needs to be done. This is early time. We'll have to see it during the months to come and the next year as well. Good, it's consistent. I'm happy about it. And I think no one can take away the time when India is actually at a crux today, where it can tremendously benefit from some of this. And I do feel confident that 7.78% is achievable. If there's one area where I wanted some more stress from the budget, was there wasn't too much said about export promotion. India is a large domestic market, and the budget says so, and all the policies are towards inward investment, but I think enough statements of strategic nature on growing India's exports consistently is somewhat missing in terms of both as a strategy or as actually support. There's a little bit, but these are cottage industry kinds which are nice, but they sound a bit passé to me. Yeah.
That's a very interesting point you mentioned, because if you were to look at services export, in which India has a massive advantage, the internal restrictions on services are amongst the highest. And that's ironic, because that militates against export of manufacturers eventually as well.
Taking on from what Rohan mentioned, demystifying the tax code. I've spent about 25 years in finance. I still don't understand the tax code, and I'm very grateful for Rohan for having said that the smart bureaucrat in India and a chartered accountant is able to understand it. I just can't understand that tax code. And the other side of it, which means reducing face-to-face, any manual handling of tax between a taxpayer and the tax administrator. The government has introduced a certain e-filing system. I think that needs to be taken up in a big way, and I think that will lead to a huge amount of complications being removed. But one last word on the 5 trillion was, I think 25 years back you folks would talk about MBO, management by objective, isn't it? Now, nobody understands management by objective better than Mr. Modi. Mr. Modi believes in the fact, set a target, pick up a whip all the bureaucrats, they'll deliver to target. And yes, they do deliver. To that extent, the objective is, or the target is 5 trillion. The finance minister herself has said it took India 55 years to reach a 1 trillion GDP. Now, we've reached 2.7, nearing 3, and they want to get to 5 trillion in the next 4 years, 5 years, whatever it is. I think it's achievable because we are on the cusp, on the threshold of being able to do it. And I said earlier, all the plantings have been done. So whether it's e-filing, if it's infra, if it's Awas Yojana, if it's public spending, etc., all the plantings have been done. It has been done, what I would believe in is in a very low profile fashion. And soon we will come out, government will come out with the kind of announcements that require to ensure the kick-starting of each of these.
Thank you, Mr. Rai, and I could hear the applause, collective applause of tens of millions of taxpayers for whom the months of March and April are almost a nightmare.
So millions aside, I myself,
No, very briefly, I think for me the most interesting aspect of the budget has been the introduction of the overseas sovereign bond scheme, which I think can make a fundamental difference to the emerging market experience in terms of this. But what I expected from the budget, because I think the budget really, this particular budget at least, had the political capital of doing so in terms of no political imperatives. I wished for some expenditure reduction, which really was necessary, because otherwise, I think without being uncharitable on any front, I think this particular government's record in fiscal consolidation has not been great. There have been deviations from the fiscal path, and it's important to maintain that. And for that, I think the pressure is not that much on revenues as much it is on expenditure. That was missing.
Thank you very much. And on that note, would you please join me in expressing a vote of thanks to our participants and also the organizers? Thank you.